Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, October 6th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy writes a letter to civil defense leaders urging them to prioritize building nuclear fallout shelters. That same year, he pressed Congress to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars for public shelters across the country that could serve in the case of nuclear attack. And this letter that JFK wrote, there's actually some really striking language in there. So I'm going to quote from it. He writes, "There is a need for a nationwide understanding of what each level of government, each private organization, and each citizen can do to bring about and protect the population against the major effects of a thermonuclear attack." And that's really what we're going to talk about in this episode. Shelters, but also this pervasive fear of nuclear attack that Kennedy is getting at and existed throughout much of the early and mid-60s. Here to discuss, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hey, Jody.
So take us to 1961. Does Kennedy write this letter and all of a sudden shelters start getting built all across the country?
That is definitely the impression that I think most of us have, that Americans ran out and started getting out their shovels and digging in their backyards and building these fallout shelters. But it actually wasn't that popular of an initiative. I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that, but by early 1962, only about 1.4% of Americans had these fallout shelters. But not only were they not nearly as widespread as popular culture would have us think, but they just weren't that popular.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I guess we should define a little bit when we say shelter, right? I mean, I guess it falls on a couple different levels. So one is, I think some people were building shelters in their homes or thinking about how to retrofit parts of their homes into shelters. But then there was certainly an initiative to build public shelters and then also to retrofit other spaces. And I mean, I think you can still see these signs around, but I certainly, when you walk by, especially if you walk by like armories or other big buildings, you'll see these nuclear fallout shelter signs. And I remember kind of growing up looking at this and, we didn't live in the 60s and we're going to talk about this. It wasn't something that I felt very deeply, but I would see these signs and be like, wait, this is a nuclear fallout shelter. Like I'm supposed to be thinking about where I go in the case of a nuclear attack, but that really is the case. It's very visceral in the way that you describe in the early 60s.
Yeah, I grew up in the countryside and had never seen one of these until I moved to New York in the 2000s. And I would walk by buildings in Morningside Heights, and there would be these yellow signs with the nuclear symbol on them. And I had to go home to my computer, and I'm like Googling them, looking them up and trying to figure out what they are. And they're nuclear fallout shelters, which struck me as so incredibly weird. But that's what ended up happening in cities because, what are you going to do in your apartment? Build a fallout shelter? You don't have, there's no place to do it. So in cities, it was these public spaces. And then these messages about fallout shelters were really aimed at people in the suburbs so that they would have a place. They'd be near enough to a city. So the assumption here is that nuclear bomb goes off. It goes off in a city. Probably not going to do so well. People out way far in the countryside are far enough away from this, but people in the suburbs are close enough that they're going to have some real problems if they don't have a place to hide out for a while. And that was the idea behind these fallout shelters. Again, it could be in your basement, it could be some place you dug in the background, but it was some place you could escape that would have rations and be sealed off from all of that radiation that would be falling from the sky.
Right. And when we think about kind of the way that people prepared at a practical level for a nuclear attack. There's the shelters, and then there was, duck and cover, and you talk to anyone who grew up in the 60s, and they would do duck and cover drills in their schools. And I will say the notion of going to an armory and holding up there for 2 weeks, like maybe I could feel like, okay, that's doing something. I'd always thought of duck and cover as just, this is not actually going to protect you, just to get under a desk. And I think that's part of what makes it so sort of awful and kind of is that it is sort of theater in this sense. And I think that certainly makes me think of now, and as we're living through a big moment of crisis, what are the things we do that just kind of are about practical reactions to what's going on, and what are the things we do that are more emotional and more just to help us get through and feel like we're giving ourselves a sense of control.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially about these duck and cover drills. So in 1952, the Civil Defense Department creates this it's kind of a cartoon, kind of a live action video that teachers are supposed to show in classes that explain how you're supposed to duck and cover if there's a nuclear blast. And it's all about making a nuclear blast seem like something like a fire drill or a sunburn or something like that, making it relatable, making it less scary, and doing something to make it feel like there's something you can do about this. Hiding under a desk, probably not super increasing your chances of survival. And when it came to these shelters as well, I mean, at first they were looking at places that really could shelter you from radiation over the course of a few weeks. The federal government went out and they surveyed American cities, and they just couldn't find that many places like that. So they kept lowering the safety rating until they found enough places that they could go out and say, okay, people, we have fallout shelters for you in case this happens. So it really is about tamping down a very real fear, which Americans had. Most Americans thought that a nuclear attack was coming, and this is how you dealt with it.
Yeah. And I want to get to that fear, because I think that's also just something we sort of can't feel and forget about this era, just how pervasive that fear was. But, on the duck and cover and the sort of smaller things that people were trained to do. I mean, I can't help but think of like active shooter drills that a lot of kids go through now in schools. And a lot of the conversation around those is that the drills themselves are traumatizing. And not to get too far off on a tangent here, but, it seems to me like an active shooter drill and a duck and cover drill again, aren't really talking about the thing at the heart of it, which is, guns and weapons. But at the same time, I will say, like, I am also a believer that doing things to make people feel like they have a sense of control are important. And it's such a tricky line, and we're going through it with COVID. How you arm people with information, but you don't, to quote our president, you try not to cause panic. And I don't know. I mean, it's really hard. These things are hard.
They are hard. And I think that it doesn't have to be an either or situation. People should have things that they can do, not only to make themselves feel safer, but actually to be safer. I mean, a little less when it comes to nuclear weapons, but, there are ways to barricade a room to make yourself safer in an active shooting situation. There are things that we can do, like wearing masks, to make ourselves a little safer during the pandemic. But there also has to be attention paid to the structural issues that are behind these problems, right? Like, we shouldn't be on the brink of nuclear war all the time. We shouldn't be in a situation where a gunman can walk into the school at any moment. We probably shouldn't be in a case where 200,000 Americans have already died of this disease. So there are still structural reforms that need to happen, and most of the control lies elsewhere. But there are things people can do to protect themselves. And that's kind of the multi-level message people have to hold in their heads.
And I mean, that's obviously where, clear leadership and clear messaging and listening to experts, really comes into play. I do think we are going to encounter some echoes of this in the next year or so around the sort of process out of COVID. And particularly, people talk about security theater. And in the months after 9/11 or in the years after 9/11, we had a lot of this, like we all have to take our shoes off in an airport because one person tried to blow up one airplane unsuccessfully with something in their shoes. But, at the same time, if that provides a little bit of comfort, it might be worth it. And I think like things like spraying down airplanes or hand sanitizer or all these things that we thought really mattered with COVID, and maybe we're learning don't, but they still may linger with us. We're going to be navigating that line around like theater and actual practical fighting of it for a while now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's another level here. There's that individual level of theater where you're kind of inconvenienced by having to take off your shoes or have your forehead scanned or what have you. But there's another layer of theater that involves like racially profiling neighborhoods or passengers that also serves as security theater. It doesn't necessarily make anyone safer, but it's there to make you feel safer if you're not one of the people being racially profiled. So I think that theater works on a couple of different levels.
That's a good point. So let's go back to fear, which is, I guess, the theme of this episode. But, you cited it, and I mean, it is remarkable. In 1961, a majority of Americans believed a nuclear war would take place within 5 years. That is just one of those stats that just kind of like knocks you over. I mean, I don't really know what to say about that other than it just reminds me. And, again, you talk to anyone who lived in the 50s and 60s, and I think that's just was just this hum of fear throughout that entire era.
I think it's a really important stat to keep in mind because we talk about things like these duck and cover drills, and they're made fun of, right? Like, they're so funny. These fallout shelters, like, can you believe people were digging out little shelters in their backyard? But people lived with a pervasive fear of nuclear war and what nuclear war would mean, right? The idea that it would wipe out the entire country, right? Yeah. Like, everyone you knew would be dead, that you could end life on the planet, which I think for many people at the time, and maybe the example or the corollary now is climate change, but yes, that sense was always there in the background and sometimes very much there in the foreground. And that's a hard thing to manage on a daily basis.
Right. And I think it is different from COVID in that a nuclear war truly is out of an individual's hands. I mean, I guess, you can vote for the right people or you can protest or whatever. But, COVID, there was always at some level a personal action could have some effect. It may not have solved the overall crisis. Whereas in a nuclear war, I mean, I can imagine the sense of helplessness and the sense of if this war happens, it really is going to happen. Someone else is going to make that decision for me and lead us to that. And so I think that's a different kind of fear in the way that you describe.
And it absolutely suffuses culture, right? Like, shows
Yes.
like The Twilight Zone, this was the constant theme. And even shows that weren't about nuclear war were actually kind of about nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really did thread through every part of culture.
Okay, so coming back to Kennedy's remarks here and his call for more shelters, he did get some pushback along the lines that we've been discussing. We've seen in this era of you're scaring people, you're causing panic more than you're helping. How much in 1961 and 62 is it all of America or a certain class of Americans are just now all of a sudden starting to build shelters in their backyard and look around and try and heed these words?
So again, not all Americans were rushing out to build these shelters. A very small percentage were, but still we're talking about, again, hundreds of thousands of shelters. And that actually leads people open to being a little bit vulnerable because, as you can imagine, fear plus this kind of presidential directive leaves some people able to be scammed by unscrupulous fallout shelter peddlers. And that is certainly what happens. According to Consumer Reports, there were 200,000 home fallout shelter assembly kits sold during these years. And you can imagine, probably a shelter assembly kit is not going to be the most robust against a hydrogen bomb. But, people were parted from their money and there was a crackdown fairly soon after that.
Yeah, but the pop-up economy around fear and the scamming around fear has always been there and it continues to be there.
Absolutely.
Today, the scammers will always come out of the woodwork, I suppose. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about, and, you as listeners know, do so much research about the rise of conservatism in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but there's a prepper element there a little bit. And so it makes me wonder if you can see any of the roots of that kind of thinking, that prepper culture or whatever you want to call it, in here. And does it at all draw a through line, through the decades and even into now?
Oh, yeah. Your average suburbanite wasn't a prepper, but there
Correct.
Already were people in the 1950s and 60s who were fearful that the commies would come any day now or that a new big U.S. government was going to come for them any day now. And they started stockpiling and prepping. And over the course of the coming decades, there were always different things that were going to cause the end times. Maybe it would be the World Trade Organization, or maybe it would be the literal end times with the return of Christ. But there
or a comet.
Exactly. And so there is this prepper community, and it's all kinds of things like stockpiling gold, stockpiling medicines, stockpiling survival seeds so that you could plant your own garden. There are all kinds of economies around prepping and whole communities and cultures around it.
I can't believe we went this whole episode and didn't talk about like spam, right? Spam was like there was like a whole culture of food and other sort of things that can live in a shelter for years and years, right?
It was the era of packaged and canned goods in many American households.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. We will end on spam, as any good meal does. Nicole Hemmer, thanks as always.
Thanks, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Brittany Brown is our other producer. Follow us on social media. We're posting a bunch of stuff on Twitter and Instagram every day at thisdaypod. Keep sending us emails, thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.